Nutrient cycling in streams. This is kind of what's happening. It's going, we have input largely of inorganic ions. These are the ones that are going to regulate productivity to a great extent. And they're taken up by our producers, which make them into organic ions in their little producer bodies. And then our producers are eaten by our consumers. And of course, our consumers get all their nutrients not from inorganic ions in the water, but from consuming producers, or if you're something big and scary, by consuming other consumers. Nice. And so, we talked about the fact that streams are essentially like one directional flows of everything, right? Or one directional flows. And so these inorganic ions can enter any part of the stream from all these different sources here. And I mentioned atmosphere. It's really only elemental nitrogen that's going to come across their end too. And that'll have to be transformed to usable form. But all these other sources that can come from the groundwater, out of the sediment, especially in the case of phosphorus, right? From upstream surface runoff. Cool. And again, as mentioned, generally, if we want to know like what nutrient levels are like in streams, we'll measure the inorganic ions. So like the ammoniums, the orthophosphates, that kind of stuff. So because these nutrient cycles are happening in flowing water, we talk about it using a term called nutrient spiraling. Because as those nutrients are cycling from the inorganic ion into our producers, into organic ions, and then moving their way through the food web, ultimately to be mineralized back into the inorganic ion, whether it's through excretion from the consumer or decomposition of the consumer, is that whole cycle is happening, it's moving downstream. So this concept of nutrient spiraling describes the idea that nutrients through this whole thing are moving downstream. So again, one of the big differences between streams and any other ecosystem, right, is this constant directional flow of everything. So if nutrients are generated in one location, they're not necessarily going to affect that location. They're more likely to affect what's going on downstream. And we talked about productivity being limited by either nitrogen or phosphorus, depending on where we are. So when nutrients come into the stream that are in demand, like if it's a stream that's where primary productivity is limited by nitrogen, then when there's nitrogen input, we'd expect that to be taken up real quick, whereas phosphorus would not be taken up quite as quickly. So this whole cycle is essentially happening as we move downstream. And so you hear the term nutrient spiraling used instead of nutrient cycling. The cycle sort of brings to mind notions of like in one location, whereas it's all moving downstream in the streams. Cool. Just an illustration to show that. This is an experiment where the authors used radioactive tracers, in this case of phosphorus. They released that into the water, and then they saw how much of it remained in the water as you moved downstream. And so they had stations that were 15 meters down. This is in a headwater stream. 15 meters down, 47 meters down, then 120 meters down. And, what you see is that, by the time you went 120 meters down the stream, there was still some of that phosphorus in the stream, about a third of it remaining after they'd released it. But that over 100 meters or so, all that 2/3 of that phosphorus had been taken up by the producers. So, and we would expect that, this was probably, this was a phosphorus limited stream. So the stuff was getting taken up pretty quickly. But when you think about it, if you release it into the water, what is it that's taking it out of the water? It's our producers, right? But where are those producers in the stream? Like physically, the stream bed, right? So imagine, you know, this is headwater streams. It's pretty small. I don't know, maybe a meter deep at max. So you've got concentrated nutrients in the water. But the only nutrients that can get taken out are those that are close to the substrate, because that's where the producers are. So the other day, with Anthony's discussion paper, we talked about how important these headwater streams are to nutrient dynamics in the watershed. One of the main reasons is because there's a higher ratio of surface area of the substrate to volume of the water. Because if you got nutrient input into a big river that's 10 meters deep, a lot of it's not even going to come in contact with the producers. They're not going to get taken up, right? But if it's in a small headwater stream, we're going to have mixing because of riffles and things like that. And we're going to have more of that water being in contact with the substrate where our producers are. Cool. Yeah, so if we were to look at a bunch of different streams and think about rates of nutrient uptake, what might cause some streams to take nutrients up faster than another? Thoughts? Rate of sunlight? Yeah, absolutely. Got to have those producers able to photosynthesize quickly to take it up. What else? Temperature. Yep, most biological processes, faster orbit temperatures. Yep. Oxygen. Yeah, so oxygen, interesting one. So how does oxygen play a role? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, where we have more mixing, we'd have more gases in general. Yeah, and so yeah, I suppose that could. I didn't take that into account, but yeah, if you've got more mixing, right? And we find, so that's a good point. That's a good observation, right? That we have higher productivity near riffles. And that could be for a number of reasons as well. Any other thoughts on what uptake, what affects nutrient uptake? How's that going to play a role? Okay. Yeah, sure. Up to a limiting point, right? Up to where the limiting won't. Yeah. So when you have more out there, you can take up more until you're maxed out. Cool. So I'll just show a couple examples, and I think y'all hit most of the points I was going to think about. But this is a study where they looked at agricultural watersheds in the Midwest in Illinois. And what they found was that very little nitrogen was removed. So because of that, there was a lot of nitrogen exported. And so, looking at this river, right, deeper, a lot of volume, probably not so much productivity going on here. You contrast that to a headwater stream. This is one Wet Walker Branch in Tennessee. And there was almost no nitrogen export. It was all getting taken up. Kind of going back to this idea of headwater streams that we talked about earlier. So this idea of the amount of nutrients relative to demand is going to be important. So areas that receive, I totally agree with what Michael said, that, where you have no nutrients at all, then as you increase nutrient levels, you can take up more and more. And then we'll hit a threshold where we're not able to take up anymore. And so then you're going to export it downstream. So again, in these headwater streams that don't have a lot of nutrients coming in, they're going to suck that all up. But then when you have lots coming in, like from these agricultural watersheds, it sort of swamps out the system, and then you have more going downstream. Just a little graphic from the Peterson et al. Article from last class. One of the things they noticed was that streams in the far north had lower rates of nitrogen uptake. So these were a couple in Alaska, if you're in Alaska. This is Bear Brook in New Hampshire. And so, temperature as it relates to productivity is going to play a role here as well. So generally, warmer systems are going to have more productivity. So temperature, as Elijah had mentioned, especially as it relates to productivity rates, are going to be important. So streams that have larger producer communities are going to be able to take more out. It's a figure from your book looking at, again, several sites across the U.S., looking at stream discharge. And they were looking at ammonium and how long it took for that ammonium to get taken up. And again, it's like you might expect, right? So here's Bear Brook. It's a river in Ohio. And so streams that had very low discharge, again, taking it up more rapidly. So this maybe relates to our agricultural example as well, but so is a role. I don't know, picture one of these rivers in Alaska, similar thing. They looked at discharge as well in this one river, and then they looked at the distance that, in this case, nitrate traveled before it was taken up. And as there was more and more flow, again, as you might expect, the nitrate was taken up further and further downstream. So the streams that are going to be taking up the most nutrients are going to be flowing slower. They're going to have less water in them, right? So again, you think these headwater streams. So this is discharge, which is not technically flow velocity, right? It's the amount of water moving past the point. I think you got the point. Okay. The river and stream discharge also plays a role. So we have higher uptake rates of nutrients where there's lower discharge. And then again, comparing geographical areas, Sycamore Creek out in Arizona, these authors did a kind of interesting thing. They looked at the timing after the flood and nitrate uptake length. In other words, when you put nitrate particles into the stream and you follow them, how long do they have to move downstream before they get taken up? Any ideas what might be going on here? What would we just conclude from looking at the graph, first of all? Any thoughts? So as time gets longer and longer since the flood, right? So the flood, this is 2 days after the flood. Imagine this is where the flood happens. And a few days after that flood, I should mention, the water levels have returned to relatively normal. But a few days after that flood, nitrate on average was traveling 3,000 meters before the stream took it up, before it got taken up by producers. Now, as we go more and more and more time after the flood, all of a sudden, 30 days after the flood, that nitrate's getting taken up within 500 meters. So it's only traveling a sixth as far as it did right after the flood. What might be going on there? Any thoughts? Yeah. Our producers, the periphyton that's on those rocks, when you have a flood that comes through, it's going to wash all those off the rocks. And so there's not going to be any there to take up the nitrate, or very little there to take up the nitrate. So as time goes on here, then that community of producers gets established, and then it's able to take it up. So another thing that's important is what we might call the disturbance stage of the stream. Like how long has it been since there's been a flood or something that just like rolled those rocks around on the bottom of the stream, washed the periphyton off, you know. That'd be an interesting study. That'd be a pain though, because you'd have to like recover rocks after they rolled along the stream bed. I was going to say to pick different sizes of rocks and look at, you know, start with no algae on them and then look at how much algae they had, and yeah, see if there's a difference in size of rocks. Kind of like this case study I look at in my intro class of rocks in the intertidal zone, but you can do it in a stream. But you'd have to be able to find them again, which would be challenging. We could put little GPS trackers on them, or we could borrow from David Strayer's playbook and wrap them in tinfoil. But I think the odds of rocks wrapped in tinfoil staying in the stream for very long are pretty low. What are RFID tags? Oh, those. Oh, yeah, yeah. Could do that. Just like, did we talk about this? They do that with freshwater mussels. Yep, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Some of y'all saw Jeremy Tieman's talk. You talked about, yeah, we could do that. And then go looking for them and hope they didn't wash like a mile downstream. Rocks, rock hounds. That project would rock. So thinking about how consumers affect spiraling, if you imagine that we have a bunch of cute, isn't he cute? It's a little grazing heptageniid mayfly. Isn't it cute? I know, right? If Wild for Life was selling one of those costumes, I wouldn't care what size it was. I would make it fit. So imagine that we have a whole lot of these little grazing mayflies on the stream. How are they going to affect nutrient spiraling? How are they going to play a role? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. So going to reduce what we sometimes refer to as the standing crop of producers. So yeah, there'll be less producer biomass, right? So we might lengthen the spiral. Mm-hmm. And then where are those nutrients going? So it's consuming those nutrients. Where are those nutrients ending up ultimately? Yeah, yeah. Right, right. And then what eats them? Is it a bigger fish? Is it a bird? Is it a raccoon? Right. Where those nutrients go? It could depend. But yeah, certainly those nutrients staying there in the insect body. That on the other hand, I don't know. Maybe that would kind of shorten the web. But remember, these guys drift downstream. So that's going to happen too. I just had a couple thoughts. One thing that they're going to be doing is they're going to be sort of accelerating the local cycle. So imagine if these aren't there, we get the algae standing crop that grows. It grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And so that keeps the nutrients there. But now it's being grazed. And as it's being grazed, some of those nutrients are going into their insect bodies. Then also some of those nutrients are being excreted. And so where those nutrients would have been staying in their organic form, in the biomass of our algae, it's being mineralized back into the inorganic form, right? Into the nitrates, ammonium, that kind of thing. So when you have a whole lot of I said consumers in general, but grazers in particular, they're going to be moving it back from the organic compartment back into that inorganic ion phase through their metabolism. But of course, some of those nutrients also are going to be contained in these invertebrates. So it'll just depend on where they go. And in general, what's interesting, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, is that I don't know if this happens in the terrestrial realm or not. Like if you have a lawn, right? And you don't mow that lawn. Does anyone know if the rate of productivity is higher or lower than if we were to mow it every week? Does anyone know? So yeah, so that's what happens in aquatic systems. That if we have grazers that are grazing on the periphyton, it will cause that periphyton to keep growing at a faster rate. Yeah, and part of it is that you get cells that kind of stop photosynthesizing. Like if you imagine like a strand of algae, right? The oldest cells on that strand are not photosynthesizing as fast as the younger cells. So when you have a grazer that's constantly keeping that graze down, you constantly have those younger cells that are photosynthesizing more. So it's strange because you have less biomass. And to some extent, it depends on how we standardize it, right? But if we look, I've never walked this far. If we look at photosynthesis rates per producer biomass, it's much higher when there's grazing going on. The thing is, we'd have a lot more biomass when there's no grazers. So, you know, in most streams, in streams where these mayflies are grazing, are we likely to have really long, lush patches of algae? Say this guy's feeding in a riffle. Are we likely to have really long, stringy patches of algae in riffles? We're not, right? Just because of all the other stuff going on, the flooding, all that kind of stuff. So we don't usually have a ton of biomass, even in relative, in any kind of stream. So often when we have these consumers, what it does is it keeps photosynthesis going faster because they consume those older cells, and what you have left is the younger algae, the more active algae. There's some analogy there with people, but I'm not even going to try to develop it. And so you actually get some quicker uptake there. The caveat being, if you don't have grazers, as Torin mentioned, and you get a really big producer community, then you can have more nutrient uptake. So there's some middle ground. All right. So here's a picture of the Davidson River. This is actually downstream. This is, out like after it flows out of the national forest. This is not far from where it hits the French Broad, actually. But, there's been a lot of discussion, big picture, about ecosystem metabolism, because with climate change being driven by increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere, it's good to know what ecosystems take CO2 out of the atmosphere and then store it. So forests are really important for that reason. Wetlands are really important for that reason. Streams don't really do that. So if we just imagine, right, of course, we have carbon that comes into these streams through allochthonous pathways over land, and then also autochthonous pathways with in-stream production. It can go a few different ways, right? But what's going to happen is that the heterotrophs of all different varieties, so these can include microorganisms like, I was able to incorporate this into my lecture, amobas, but even myofauna and macro, whatever they are, they're all out there consuming the carbon, and then ultimately they're going to turn it into CO2 through respiration, right? So our grazer eats the carbon, it's respiring, turns it into CO2, and also into its body. But then a fish or a scary hellgrammite comes along and eats that grazer. It takes that carbon, turns some of it into CO2 and some of it into its body. Then a bigger fish comes along and eats that. It turns some of that energy into CO2 and some in its body. It keeps going on until the consumer dies, and then all of its carbon gets turned into CO2 eventually, right? Okay, so there's this constant mineralizing, right? And so mineralizing just means turning it back into its inorganic form. Okay, so it's taking, of course, the carbohydrates and turning them back into CO2. So that's happening, and then of course, just like nutrient spiraling, we're exporting whatever is in our stream downstream. But we don't see a whole lot of long-term carbon storage, right? So with trees in the forest, trees can live for hundreds of years, of course. They're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere with those incredible CO2 removal machines called leaves, and they're using it to grow their tree bodies, and that tree body stays there for hundreds of years and stores the carbon, right? Wetlands, for several different reasons, they store it in their roots. You get decomposition that occurs, or you get carbon that's stored under sediment, and so it doesn't break down as much. Wetlands are also important. Streams, we don't have that. There's really no place to store the carbon. It's going to be used up. It's going to be turned into consumer body mass. It's going to be turned into CO2. It's going to move downstream. So in streams, we're not storing a lot of carbon. We're burning it up. So just to review, these equations aren't balanced. This isn't chemistry class, but I just want to think about input and output real quick. That for photosynthesis, of course, we need CO2, got lots of water. And then in the presence of light, when there's chlorophyll around, right, it gets turned by our producers into the glucose and oxygen. And then our consumers turn around and they take that glucose and in the presence of oxygen, burn it up, turn it back into CO2 and energy. And so, of course, it can cycle back and forth here, right? Where you have this nice system where the end product of one process is the input to another. So both of these are going on. And again, just thinking about the carbon, right? So with photosynthesis, we're sucking carbon out and taking it from a mineral to an organic form. Respiration, we're switching it around. So if we look back at our kind of idealized stream energetic pathway big picture, this is the only place in this where photosynthesis is happening, right? We've got our light that's coming up to our producers. On the other hand, we've got all these other places where respiration is happening. And so we can talk about the ratio of photosynthesis to respiration to know which of these processes is most important. And I don't want to give away what the paper talks about, but you know, you just think about which of these happens more in streams, right? Depending on where we are in the river continuum. So that's essentially what Mulholland et al. Did, and they looked at it similarly to the Peterson et al. Paper across different biomes in different parts of the Americas.